Good afternoon, Happy New Year, and thank you for joining us for the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn program. A live transcript for this program is available on Zoom for anyone who would like to use it. Click Live Transcript at the bottom of the screen and click Show Subtitles. I'm Alana Cohn-Kennedy, the Chief Operating Officer at the Holocaust Center for Humanity. I want to thank our 2022 Lunch and Learn series sponsors who helped to make these programs possible: the City of Seattle Office of Arts and Culture and the Francis Roth and Stanley R. Schill Foundation. If you or your company are interested in being a sponsor for a Lunch and Learn program or even a series, let us know. Your support makes these programs possible. Today, we are keeping the chat open and we encourage you to communicate with each other. We recognize that over the past 20 months of virtual Lunch and Learn programs, this has become a wonderful community of curious and passionate people with countless stories and experiences to share. Please consider your comments carefully and keep all comments respectful to all who are joining us for this program. It is with sadness that I tell you that Paula Stern, an Auschwitz survivor who made her home in Seattle, died on Saturday at the age of 99. Paula clearly remembers the increasing restrictions against Jews in Germany. She was a young adult at the time. In 1940, she moved out of her hometown to a farm outside of Berlin that had a mission to prepare Jews to move to Israel. There she met Klaus, who would become the love of her life. The two were married on the farm in 1942, and only 8 months later were deported to Auschwitz. They both described the painful, frightening separation and the uncertainty of whether they would ever see each other again. Before being separated, they made a plan. Should they survive, they would meet back in Paula's hometown of Arnstadt, Germany. 18 months later, Paula, having survived the brutality of Auschwitz and a death march in the winter of 1945, in which thousands died, she was one of the few survivors. She made her way back to her hometown with the faint hope that Klaus might meet her there. Weeks later, she received a note from a soldier passing through.
I found a piece of paper written with a pencil. Paula, I survived. I'm in Bavaria. Stay where you are. I'm in a hospital, but I come as soon as I can. And that was the only notice I know that he was alive. And it took about the last week in August.
Klaus and Paula were the first survivor couple to come to Seattle in 1946, making their new home in an apartment on Capitol Hill in Seattle. They were founding members of the Holocaust Center in 1989, and Klaus shared his story of survival and his love and reunion with Paula with audiences throughout the Pacific Northwest. Paula rarely shared her story publicly, but she was a force, encouraging others to do so and always supporting the importance of Holocaust education. It was an honor to know Paula, and she will be greatly missed by me and so many others. It is our responsibility to carry these stories forward when the survivors are no longer with us. It is our responsibility to tell the stories and to keep them in our memories. As survivor Elie Wiesel wrote in his memoir, Night, to forget the dead would be akin to killing them a second time. And so here today, we have the opportunity to hear another story, the survival story of Sam and Esther Goldberg, who remarkably defied all the odds and survived the Holocaust together in the heart of the murderous landscape of Eastern Poland. Local author Karen Triger is Sam and Esther's daughter-in-law. She and her family traveled to Poland to walk in Sam and Esther's footsteps and to meet the children of the Righteous Gentiles that helped them survive. Karen Triger retired from her law practice in 2015 to research and write her in-law's story. She graduated from New York University Law School with honors in 1988, where she served as editor-in-chief in the Law Review. She lives in Seattle and is an accomplished and dynamic speaker, as you will clearly see today. Karen has presented at many continuing legal education conferences, community events, and is a member of the Holocaust Center for Humanities Speakers Bureau. Karen will take questions at the end of the program. Please use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen to type in questions at any time. I might miss them in the chat, so be sure to put them in the Q&A. Karen, we are so honored to have you with us today. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Alana. And I'm so sad about Paula. You know, she was amazing. And what you said about the stories and carrying the stories forward, we will all remember Paula and Klaus, and we will remember it is our job and it is our task. Part of our task in this world is to remember the stories of those who died, who were murdered in Nazi Germany. And that's why I decided to write this book, because my in-laws, Sam and Esther Goldberg, are two among the many survivors. Their families were totally murdered. Their large families were all murdered by the Nazis. And I think if you hear the story of one or two people that survived the Holocaust, that went through it, that we can all better understand what it was like. And it's when we can better understand what it's like that we can stand up against hatred and bigotry in our own world and in our own society. And that's why it's really important for us to keep telling these stories. So thank you, Ilana. And I will just, with that introduction, I will just jump into my presentation. Give me 1 second. I'm just going to have to start the slideshow. Except I can't get to it. Sorry, I'm going to try that again. Okay. There we go. There we go. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm so happy that you were able to join us to hear this story. And even though there's hard parts to this story to hear about, there are joyous parts and there are inspiring parts. And I hope that what you all take away from this is what I took away from researching and studying this story and the Holocaust for 3 years, is that we all have good and evil inside of us, and let's do our best to bring out the good parts and put the evil parts somewhere else, send them away. So Sam and Esther, escape, rescue, and resilience. When I talk to students through the Holocaust Center, I go to schools, middle schools, high schools, colleges, and I talk to them about the importance of research. And, you know, I think that everybody on this call probably understands the importance of research to do a good job with anything that we do. But today, what I'm going to spend my time on is telling you the story of my mother-in-law and my father-in-law, Sam and Esther Goldberg, two incredible Holocaust stories. And I'm going to start with Sam. Sam was born in a small town called Bagatella, Poland. This is where it was here. You can see its relationship sort of to Warsaw to get a sense of where it was. And the thing I can tell you about Bagatella, Poland, is that it was a very, very small town. It was a farming village. And I visited with my family in 2016. It is one street that just winds through, and there's farms. There's a barn here and a house here, and honestly, a lot of cows. There's a lot of cows, and it smells like a lot of cows. And the Goldberg family, in fact, had a lot of cows, and they were farmers. They grew crops and they sold timber and cattle. And that's how they made a living. And they were a family that was a loving and warm family. There were 6 children. Sam was the second youngest of all the children. And when the war started, this town that he lived in, I'll just share, Bagatella, was a mixed town, mixed in the sense that it had about half of the population were Jewish people, and about half the population were non-Jewish people. And when the war began in September 1st, 1939, it was catastrophic for everyone, certainly everyone in Poland, but especially for the Jews. And when the Nazis invaded, they came to every town and they took control very quickly. They would come in, and I'll talk more about this with Esther's town because it's more dramatic, but they would come in and start shooting people and create terror. And people got scared. They were terrified. That word works here. And because of that, people were afraid, and some people ran away and some people just cowered. Sam's siblings, his 5 siblings, all of whom were married at the time when the war started. Sam was the only sibling not married, and they all left right away. And they went, we'll talk about it in a minute, to the Soviet side, the Soviet controlled part of Poland. Sam stayed with his parents. And in November, so September, the war began, and in November, the Nazis came to their farm and they said, Jews, raus, out, get out of here. And they're like, anyway, it doesn't matter what they tried to argue. The Nazi soldiers that were there told them, we will kill you if you don't leave, so you're leaving. So they did leave, and they were able to take 1 cow and their horse and buggy that they owned, and they went. Now, this map that I'm showing you right now was a really important map for me. Someone who, I went to the Seattle Hebrew Academy. I grew up here in Seattle, and I studied the Holocaust in those days, but that meant watching those really horrible movies, with the documented film from Buchenwald and these places with just piles of dead bodies. And that was in my mind. And I didn't really understand the dynamic of what happened 1939 to 1941, and then 1941 to 1945. And part of what helped me understand it was this map. Because if you see, here's my cursor, here's Germany, here's the Soviet Union, and in the middle is Poland. All this is Poland. And this yellow line that goes down the middle is the line where the Germans and the Soviets split the country in half. And they made a deal. The Germans and the Soviets said, hey, let's be friends. Why not? We won't attack you, you don't attack us, and we'll split Poland in half and everybody will be happy. And that's what happened. The Germans attacked from the west, and they took over this area of Poland, and the Soviet Union, a couple of weeks later, attacked from the east and controlled this part of Poland. And so which part of that border, that new yellow line where you lived on, mattered a lot, especially if you were a Jew. Because if you were under German control, that was one thing. And if you were under Soviet control, it meant something else. And part of what's really important to understand in September of 1939 is that Hitler and the Nazis did not yet have this grand idea that now in 2022, remarkably, I said that smoothly, 22, called the final solution. They did not have a final solution set up yet. They knew that the Jews needed to get out, raus, as they say in German, right? And they needed to get them out of their territory. They wanted the German-controlled lands to be judenrein, free or clean of Jews. But they just wanted to get them out. They did not have a grand plan to systematically murder all of the Jews of Europe. That did not happen in 1939. Many Jews were murdered. Here and there, Jews were murdered all over the German-occupied territories, but it wasn't a systematic plan that came along later. And this line here, so many hundreds of thousands of Jews who found themselves on the German-controlled side of Poland went east. They went over this yellow line to go settle over here in these lands that were controlled by the Soviet Union. Because even though it wasn't the most pleasant place to live under Soviet control, there were scarcities, there was overcrowding, but the Soviets didn't want to murder the Jews. That wasn't their main goal. So what happened with Sam's family, Sam and his parents who were remaining, they left and they went to just over that yellow line. Just remember that yellow line, and they just went over 10 miles over maybe, and they settled in a place called Kovalovka, where they had some relatives. And they became Soviet citizens. And because they became Soviet citizens, 2 things happened to Sam. One, he got a job. He started delivering mail with his horse and buggy. But then 6 months later, he got conscripted into the Soviet army. So now this 22-year, he was about 22 years old when the war broke out. This 22-year-old Jewish man from Bagatella, Poland, a farmer, is now in the Soviet army, and his army unit goes here to a place called Chechanovik. And his army unit was in charge of building bridges and repairing bridges. And he was near the German-Soviet border, that yellow line. Sam describes his time in the army as awful. He hated it. He said the food that they served them, he wouldn't have given that food to his animals on his farm. It was so bad. And so he really hated being in the army, but he had no choice. And it was here in the army, over there at Chechanovik, when the Germans said, okay, we are ripping up our friendship agreement with the Soviet Union, no more, and we are attacking. And the Germans, we all know, June of 1941, the Germans did Operation Barbarossa and attacked the Soviet Union. And they crossed that yellow line and began with the biggest fighting force that had been seen in the war. Certainly that was seen in humanity. It was tanks and infantry and bombers, and it was really, really fierce. And Sam, his army unit was bombed, and the infantry came and started shooting them. And he hid under a half-built bridge, thinking maybe they won't bomb that bridge. And he was right. But when he came out, when things quieted down, he came out and he looked around him and he saw hundreds, thousands of dead soldiers, Russian soldiers, Soviet soldiers. And anyone who was still alive was captured immediately by the Germans who were there, their infantry. And they were put into a prisoner of war camp. And here are some pictures. This is not the prisoner of war camp that Sam was put into. These are not pictures of that exact one, but you get the idea. He was put into a prisoner of war camp with thousands of other Soviet army soldiers. And it was not a good place. They didn't give them food. They didn't give them drink. They were starving. And Sam just wanted to die. Honestly, it was one of those moments throughout the course of the war where he just was like, oh, he wanted to give up. But he didn't. He didn't give up. And the story of Sam's survival from that POW camp has to do, so here's a little map that shows that he went to the POW camp. And then, but he survived and he escaped with the help of another prisoner. And they cut a hole. This other prisoner had wire cutters. Like, how did this guy have wire cutters? I don't know, but he did. And they cut a hole in the wire fence and went out at like 2 a.m. and they ran. And they ran and ran. And unfortunately, I don't have time to tell the whole story of how he escaped and got back to his parents in Kovalovka. And you can see this triangle here that gets him back to Kovalovka. But I'll tell you 3 things to whet your appetite to read more about this story. He was able to escape and survive because of a sugar cube, a screaming girl, and a scarecrow. And that's all I'm going to tell you right now, because these stories could go on forever. But he did get back to his parents, and his parents were alive. And you can just imagine the joy that they experienced when they saw him alive. And unfortunately, very soon after that, his mom, whose name was Chaya Fega, and I should have said their names. His mother's name was Chaya Fega, and his father's name was Zelig. And she suffered a stroke. And so even though the whole family, the 3 of them, wanted to travel west because they heard it was safer to go back on the other side of that now imaginary yellow line, because there was no more line. Germany controlled everything. She had a stroke and she couldn't go. So Sam went with some friends and they traveled to a town called Stochik, because they had heard that in Stochik, the Jews were able to live in a ghetto, but it was an open ghetto. There weren't walls, and they could do business and try to live some semblance of a life. So he went there and he lived there for a while. He was doing some butchering, trying to make some money, and he evaded different Nazi roundups because they were looking for laborers. But finally, his luck ran out in the beginning of June of 1941. Beginning of June 1942, his luck ran out. And he got captured by the Nazis, with 135 other men, and they were taken to a place called Treblinka. Now, when we hear that name, that word, Treblinka, we shudder. Our bodies like physically react. But when he got there was nothing there. It was a big open field. It was grass and trees, and it was in the woods. There was one shack. Those 135 men, the beginning of June, were brought there to actually be forced as slave laborers to build the camp. And those gentlemen, those men, those Jewish men, built every structure in that horrible place of death, except the gas chambers. And they built the barracks. They built the barber shop and the laundry shop, which Sam ended up being in charge of. They built the barracks for the SS officers and the Ukrainian guards. They built everything. And it was there that Sam survived for 13 months in this place of death and horror. Now, there's been a lot written and spoken about Treblinka, and far be it from me in our short time together to try to really portray the horrors of that place. And I just want to share just a couple things to personalize the place from Sam's perspective. From Sam's perspective, he was a forced slave laborer, and he was put in charge of the laundry, and he was the supervisor of the laundry. Now, this was a great job in Treblinka because he was inside, and he had pots, big pots. They used to cook the laundry in these pots with fire underneath and water. So he had a pot and fire and water, so he could cook. So when they were done, he and some of the women that he worked with would steal potatoes from the kitchen, and they would cook for themselves. And he would feed the women he worked with. And then he took whatever remained to the people in the Treblinka hospital. If you can imagine that there was such a place as a Treblinka hospital, but there was, and he would feed them to give them a little more nutrition so maybe they would survive another day. And he told me so many times, he said, I think that, everyone asks, I don't, but other people do ask Holocaust survivors, how did you survive? What was it that helped you survive? I don't ask them that question. That's an impossible question. But Sam told me freely that he thinks he survived because he took food over to those prisoners and helped them survive, maybe even one or two or three of them. And he feels that in the merit, in the Yiddish Hebrew word, the zechus of doing that action, that he was able to survive. Who knows? But that's what was in his head. Day and night, you get up in the morning at Treblinka and you didn't know if you'd be alive at the end of the day, if you were one of the about 800 men and women who were there running the camp. They did all the labor of the camp. Everyone else that came to Treblinka was murdered immediately. And I'm going to share two things with you that I learned in my research that astounded me. And I think these facts will astound you as well. The first one is they ran this camp, the Nazis ran this camp, they murdered 870,000 Jews and a few thousand gypsies, who my father-in-law said had it worse than the Jews, if you can believe that. But they did it with a workforce of 25 Nazi SS officers, 25. I couldn't believe that they did this operation with 25 Nazi soldiers, officers. There were 100 Ukrainian guards that were part of the running of the camp. They were integral to running the camp, but there were only 25 Nazi officers. That blew my mind. The other thing that blew my mind, and is horrible, and after I learned this fact, I think I just put my head down on the counter and cried for a while. The people who survived, who came to Treblinka, they came by train, and they came from Warsaw, and they came from Bialystok, and they came from all kinds of places. From the moment they stepped off the train on the platform to the time they were dead was 90 minutes. 90. That piece of information stopped me in my tracks, and it took me, I still haven't gotten over it. We're going to be together right now, this afternoon, for 60 minutes. That's 2/3 of the way towards the death for people who got off those trains. I will share with you that the people who are in the camp working, like Sam, they knew that they were not going to be allowed to survive. even if the Nazis lost the war and the Germans lost the war, which of course everyone was hoping, but they knew they weren't going to be able to survive. They were going to murder them all. So Sam was one of 50 men who got together and made a plan to have an uprising at Treblinka. And they executed that uprising on August 2nd, 1943. And it was a very secretive planning process, but Sam was part of it, and he was part of the execution. And he was one of only of the 50 men who helped to plan it. There's like 12 to 15 who actually survived. And this is a wonderful picture here of that the Soviets took this photo later in 1944 of the people they could gather together who were part of the planning group that planned and executed the uprising. And Sam is this short guy in the middle here. And yeah, there's an amazing group of men. But this picture over here I found in the Yad Vashem photo archive. And it's a remarkable photo of taken, it was about 10 kilometers away from Treblinka. And it was taken on the day of the uprising. And what it shows there with that smoke billowing out is the way that they started the uprising was they had connected a wire to the gas tanks that the Nazis used to fill up their Jeeps. And they blew it up. And the whole place, except for the gas chambers, were made of wood. So the whole place went up. It was a hot August day. The whole place went up in flames very quickly. And they blew a hole in the fence. Now, the uprising did not go as these men had planned it. And there are various narratives as to what went wrong. I'm not going to go into that. Many crazy stories about what went wrong, but it didn't go perfectly. But there was a huge hole in the fence, and all the people realized what was going on, the workers, the Jewish workers, and they all started running and started to run through that hole in the fence. And Sam did too. And he started running. And he ran through that fence and he kept running and running and running until he finally got to some woods. He had to hide because the Nazis and Ukrainians were chasing after everyone who got out. And he had to find a place to hide. And he found a patch of woods, some good solid woods where he could hide just outside of Stuchik. He ran back towards Stuchik because that's where he was. He knew where to go there. And he just decided that this is where I'm going to hide. And we, all together here today, are going to leave Sam in the woods trying to find a place to hide for just a few minutes while I pause and take a deep breath and share with you Esther's story, my mother-in-law. Esther's from a town called Stuchik. And you just heard me say the name of that town because it's where Sam was just before he got captured and taken to Treblinka. It was Esther's hometown, and she lived in that town, but they did not know each other before the war. And it was a shtetl. It was a small town. 90% of the people who lived there were Jews, 10% were non-Jews. And there were non-Jewish farmers who lived around the town and ringed it and had farms. And this is a picture. Many, many Holocaust survivors did not have pictures of their family after the war. And this is the one picture that Esther had of her parents. This is Shloima and Bracha Vishnu. Her maiden name was Vishnu, her birth name. And when the war, she had 4 siblings. She was the second to the oldest of all of her siblings. And when the war started, none of them were married at the time, but they all decided just then when the Nazis came into their town, it was the same story. They came in with bombs and screaming and shooting and burning down houses and burning down stores and terrorizing the population to make them get under control. And the Vishnu family's house was one of the houses that was burned to the ground. So they were homeless and they had nowhere to go. So they paused and decided that the best thing to do now that the Nazis were in control of their town was to go east. Like so many hundreds of thousands of other Jewish people became refugees, crossing over that yellow line to the Soviet-controlled side of Poland. And the Vishnu family went to Bialystok. Now, Bialystok was a big city, and it was 50% Jewish and 50% not Jewish before the war. But there was a huge influx of Jewish refugees in September of 1939, and it became very overcrowded. And the Soviets came around and moved people to different areas because it was just too crowded. And so the Vishnu family ended up going farther east. Look how far they went. That's how far they went, to a town called Slunum. The whole family was together in Slunum, Esther and her siblings and her parents, and they were surviving. Her father, I should have mentioned before, was a Malamed, a teacher of Jewish children, and her mother was a homemaker and helping to raise the family and help with the boys in the school. So here in Slunum in Belarus, her father started to teach Jewish children, but Esther and her two, she had one older brother and one brother that was just under her. The three of them started to handle. It's the term that they use, handle on the black market. You buy something and then you resell it. You go over here and you buy something and then you resell it for a few pennies more and you try to make a little money. And that's what they were doing. They were selling on the black market, and they were able to get enough money to survive. They could eat. They were okay. I think, though Esther never said this, and she did not like to talk. Some Holocaust survivors like to talk about this story. Some do not. Esther did at all. Sam did. Okay, so I have 1 and 1, even score. But Esther never said that her family thought, but they must have thought, okay, so this is bad. We lost our home, but we're together and we're managing. We have enough food to eat every day, and we're just going to stay here until the war's over. The war's going to be over sometime. We're okay here. We're safe. Well, that was true until the Germans ripped up their friendship agreement with the Soviet Union and attacked the Soviet Union, just like in June of 1941, which I mentioned before. And this is the turning point. Sorry for my coughs. This was the turning point when getting rid of the Jews under the Nazis became getting rid of the Jews by killing them, because they realized there were just too many Jews, 3.3 million Jews in Poland alone, not to mention the countries of the former Soviet Union, Ukraine and Belarus and Russia. There were so many Jews, they couldn't move them out of the way, and they had nowhere to put them, even if they wanted to or could. So that's when the final solution became a real thing. It didn't get called that until January of 1943, 1942. At 43, I have to think of my dates, sorry. But what happened was there was a shift. And at that point, as the German army attacked east of that yellow line, and they started to take controls of towns and cities, they had a special group of officers called the Einsatzgruppen. And that group of officers' job was to round up the Jews of every town, put them in a ghetto if they weren't already there, lock them up, and then take them out of town to a nearby forest and shoot them into a pit that had been dug, one by one, with bullets. And that is how Esther's family was murdered, just outside of Slunum. The Nazi Einsatzgruppen came, put them all into a ghetto, and then took all 10,000 Jews that were living in Slunum at the time out of town and shot them into a pit one by one. Esther's mother, her father, and her siblings were all murdered in that way. So how did Esther survive that? What happened? Well, she was in the hospital. She was suffering from typhus back since May. She'd been in the hospital. Typhus is a terribly contagious disease that is, when you're living in overcrowded and dirty conditions, it's passed in that way. And she had typhus, so she was in the hospital and she was recovering from her typhus. I tried to imagine what it felt like for her the day that she learned that her whole family and all the Jews of the town were murdered outside of town by the Nazis. I can't imagine what that felt like. I had to write about it in the book, but it was hard. That was one of the hardest pieces to write. Sorry. But how did she find out? Well, I believe, without knowing for sure, that it was her boyfriend, Moishe Kwiatek, who was her hometown boyfriend from Stochik, who had come to Slunum and lived there with her family, that came and told her, because he avoided the roundup. And he came and told her what happened. And together they decided, we're getting out of here. She left the hospital and they decided to go back home. But in a remarkable twist of fate, 2 days later, the Nazis came back to that hospital and murdered every single patient, who were all Jews, in their bed. They were cleaning up. They had to clean up. And so Esther avoided the mass murder of the Slonim Jews by being in the hospital. And then she avoided the mini massacre in the hospital by leaving right away. It blows my mind in so many directions to think about those turn of events and that series of things that happened. But Esther and Moshe decided to go back home, and they did. And they traveled. They couldn't go by train because the Germans were in control of the trains. They went by horse and buggy all the way back to Stochek. Look how far it was. It took them a long time, but they made it home, and they found Moshe's family alive and well and still living there. So they joined them, and they were living there. But then the Nazis came back. They came back because Treblinka, which was really nearby, look, here's Stochek and here's Treblinka. It's like 15 miles away. And so once Treblinka was up and running, which started July 23rd, 1942, they came over to Stochek, this small town, and gathered all the Jews and took them to Treblinka and murdered them. So how did Esther survive that? She, together with Moshe, her husband, Chaim, there's Moshe's younger brother, and Moshe's father, they hid in an attic, and somehow they were not found. It has to do in part with the fact that Esther was really, really smart. She was so street savvy. She went outside the house they were going to hide in, and she put a big lock on the outside of it, so it looked like a padlock from the outside. She put a sign on the house, and it said in German. She knew enough German, and she wrote, "A German owns this house. Stay out." And it worked. It worked. So they were up in that attic for 3 days, no food, nothing to drink. But then when the town quieted down, they came out. They had to climb out the window because they couldn't get out the front door. But they ran into the woods, and they found other survivors there too. And they all decided to go their own way. I don't know why, but Moshe's father decided to go his own way, to try to find his wife and daughter, who decided to go hide somewhere else. None of them survived the war. But Esther, together with her husband, Moshe, and the younger brother, Chaim, started knocking on doors because they were starving. Like all the Polish neighbors that they had known for so long, no one would help them. They knocked and knocked. They knocked here and they knocked there. Nobody would help them. And they went a little bit farther out of town, and they knocked on the door of the Stish family. And Helena Stish opened the door, and they knew her from their soda factory, because they would bring, the Stishes were very pious Catholics, and they would go to church every Sunday. And at the end of church, they would take their children, they would walk by the hand, and they would walk a few blocks down and go to the Kviatic soda factory and get a special treat for their children, some kind of bubbly, they had like seltzer water with like flavored syrup. Imagine like watermelon flavor or strawberry, and the kids would get a treat. That's how they knew them. And Esther and Moshe told Helena what happened. They said, "We're starving. We need to hide. Can you help us?" And Helena miraculously said yes. And she hid them in the barn, and she gave them food, and she allowed them to hide in and around their property for over the course of the next year. Except Moshe, unfortunately and sadly, one day Moshe was looking for food they were always looking for more food because there wasn't enough food for everybody. And he was in the woods scrounging for berries or mushrooms or whatever, and he got murdered. He was murdered by a Polish man. So why would this Polish man murder this Jew? Well, a lot of Poles were anti-Semitic and hated Jews, just as a baseline. But the Germans gave added incentive. They said, if you bring us dead Jews or alive, we'll kill them. We will give you 1 kilo of sugar for every Jew you bring us. 1 kilo of sugar during wartime was very valuable. So Moshe was killed. And Esther heard that, and she just wanted to be done with everything, but she didn't. Helena and her there were 2 Stish families living next to each other, and that both families helped Esther and Chaim survive until that fateful day when Sam ran away from Treblinka in the Uprising. That is where they met, because he ends up in the same patch of forest that Esther has been hiding in already for a year. And that's where they meet, in the forest where Sam is running away from Treblinka. He needs somewhere to hide. So do Esther and Chaim, because now the Nazis from Treblinka are looking everywhere for everybody. And so they go and knock on, Esther meets him in the woods, and she says, "Come with me. We'll go to Helena." They knock on the door again, and they tell Helena what happened. This man just escaped from Treblinka. You've got to hide us. They're looking everywhere. And Helena said, "Are you nuts? Are you crazy? I can't hide you. If they find you, they're going to kill you for sure, but they're going to kill me and my whole family, which would have been true, by the way, 100% true. But somehow Esther convinced her to allow them to hide. And they hid in the barn for 3 days until the big Nazi search calmed down. They came out of the barn, and Sam decided to stay and hide with Esther and Chaim. And they went deeper into the woods, and they dug a pit in the forest. And they made a wood plank that was camouflaged with forest brush on top. And they hid in that pit and had a very fancy like pulley system where they could open the top and climb out. And that's where they lived for most of the next year together, except in the very, very cold winter weather. They hid in one of the barns of the Stish family, the Vladislava family, not Helena, her sister-in-law, Vladislava. It was, to be clear, it was the women of these families that saved Sam and Esther. The whole family helped, but they were the ones who said, we are going to help. They all helped, but it was the women who were the force behind the rescue. But it was the dad of one of the families that built a box in the barn where they hid inside this box in the super cold months of the winter in Poland. You would die out in the forest. And he built a fake haystack on top of it. So if someone were to come in the barn, they would just see a haystack, which is pretty normal in a barn. But they lived either inside that little box or as soon as it was warm enough, back out in the pit for a year. Every day, almost every day, someone from the Stish family, and it was usually the youngest, whose name was Genyik, and there's a picture of him here. This is Genyik Stish. He would bring a pail of food and put it by the pit so that they could come out after dark and get some food to eat. And he was elected and nominated to do this job because he was the youngest. And it wouldn't seem funny if a little boy was running around the forest and just, playing, because if they were suspected by their Polish neighbors, they would be informed on, and their family would be murdered. And of course, Sam, Esther, and Chaim would be murdered. But as the war went on and the Soviet army was pushing back the Germans, they lived like this, like animals. It was like living like animals, lice and dirt and there was no light, no toilet, no furniture, no nothing. I mean, I can't even imagine what it was like. And it's just so hard to even think about it. But when the Soviets were moving along and conquering the territory, pushing the Germans back farther west, until they finally got to Berlin. But it was the July of 1944 when they conquered this part of Poland, and Esther and Sam and Chaim were free. And when they became free, they were like, we're free. Like, now what do we do? So Esther and Sam went back to Stochik to see if anyone was alive. Chaim went off to go try to find his family, if anyone was alive, and they were not. But Sam and Esther knew that their families were not alive, and they decided to get married. And they got married in December of 1944. And then they actually decided to stay in Poland, and they went to a town nearby, and Sam started a butcher shop. But I'm sure you've all heard stories about how horrible it was for the Jews living in Poland after the war. And Sam and Esther got wind of a plot to murder them because the anti-Semitic Poles that were living there wanted to kill them and take their business and take the little bit of money that they had saved up over this short period of time. But they escaped, and they got to Lodz and in the middle of the night, and then they ended up getting to a DP camp, and they spend a lot of time, 4 years in DP camp. But before I get there, I feel like I rushed right through the whole living in the pit thing. And I'll just share with you that when we went back, this is a picture of our family going back to visit in 2016, as Alana mentioned in my research. We went back to visit with our 4 children and my husband, and we met the surviving 3 children of the Stish family and their children and their grandchildren, and it was amazing. But Genyik, this man who's in this gray sweater, said to us, when we're done talking, we'll take you out to the forest and we'll show you the pit that your parents lived in. He said to my husband, Shlomo, and we were all like, what? You're gonna what? And so we couldn't believe it. We just couldn't believe we were going to see the pit that they lived in. We saw the barn, and okay, that was a big enough deal to see the barn where that fake haystack was. Then he walked us out into the forest, and now he's like 86 years old. He just walked like a soldier, like he was 9-year-old boy walking through that forest, going to the place where he had gone so many times before to bring a bucket of food or just to check on them to see how they were doing. He and his brother Jan told us they would just go check on them to see how they were managing. And then he stops and he points to this hole in the ground. And mind you, it's degraded. It's 75 years later, for goodness sake. It's full of leaves, but there was a hole in the ground. And this, you can kind of see it in this picture here. And Shlomo, my husband, just stepped right in it. But we all just stood there crying for a few minutes. And then when I sort of processed what I was in the middle of, I decided right there and then that I was going to have a different attitude about, sorry that this rhymes, but I was going to have a different attitude about gratitude. And that I was going to look at my life and the things I have in my life in a different way. And I was no longer going to take for granted my life and the things that I have and the people that I have in my life, because I was stared into a pit that my in-laws, who I loved and were beautiful human beings, hid like animals for a year. And I have a nice house and a refrigerator full of food and a nice warm bed to sleep in. And I cannot take that for granted, not another day. And so it changed me as a human at that moment. The whole story changed me as a human, but that moment really changed me dramatically. And I've been trying since then to live my life differently, trying to be more aware of people and things that make my life nice and easier. And just to jump back to the fact that they made it to the DP camps in Germany, they lived in Fehrenwald near Munich. Were there for 2 years. And these are just some wonderful pictures of what Fehrenwald looked like. And they were there, they got there in October of 1945. And there were professional photographers that came and took wonderful pictures of the refugees there, because they had no pictures, because they had escaped the Holocaust and lived through that. There, they also spent 2 years in Stuttgart, which was another DP camp. And it was from there, and mind you, I shouldn't have rushed through that picture, because you could see that they had a child. They had my older sister-in-law, Faye. Can I go back to that? There we go. This young girl was their daughter, Faye, my sister-in-law, who lives in the East Coast. She was born in August of 1945. And she lived with them in the DP camp for 4 years, and then came together with them to America. They came to America in 1949 when they finally got their visas, and they traveled across the ocean, heading into New York, and landing in Brooklyn. And that's where I end the book that I wrote about them, because my goal is not to tell the story of their refugee life in America, but to tell their story of what happened to them in Europe. And I joined the family, there's our wedding picture, in 1984. And it was really at that time that I began to open my mind to the story of two people, and being able to understand the story of what happened to two people helped me understand what happened to everybody. And I hope that hearing this story, as hard as it is, but that the joyfulness of meeting these rescuers that we had the opportunity to do in Poland, and knowing the Goldberg family, myself so well, it brings joy to be able to bring this story to the world. And this is a very short clip of when we first met the Stitch family members, and I'll just play it. And with that, I thank you all for listening so well, and I stop my share, and I'm really happy to take questions from anyone. And if you want to contact me offline, I'm happy to talk with you about that as well. Thank you all for being now you are part of Sam and Esther's story, and I hope that you can help to carry it on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen. That was such a powerful presentation. And I know from personal experience, having had the opportunity to go and meet the Stitch family and see this pit that remarkably is still there after so many years, is such a stark reminder of, while this feels like a long time ago, it's not so long ago. Like it's still our recent history. So thank you for doing all this research to preserve these stories. So one of the first questions that came in that I want to ask you is, It comes from Yvonne, and she wants to know, how did you learn all the details of these stories, and how did you do this research?
So thank you for that question. And I did the research. Well, I'm going to tell you where I started. I started from interviews. Sam did an interview with the Shoah Foundation, which many of us are probably familiar with. They did interviews around the country of Holocaust survivors. And that was a wonderful interview that he did. It was in Yiddish. So many years ago, before I decided to write this book, my husband and I, my husband, who speaks Yiddish, translated the interview. I transcribed it. That was my part, because I said, none of our kids speak Yiddish. And if our kids are ever going to know what your dad said in this video, we have to translate it. So I had an English translation of that interview. And my mother-in-law, Esther, who I mentioned, never liked to talk about it. But my sister-in-law, Shlomo's younger sister, Molly, got her to sit down with her one time. And she interviewed her on a camera in English. And I transcribed that. So I pulled those interviews back out, and I started there. And I said to myself, what do I need to know to fill in this story? Because it was the story, but it was very bare bones and outline. And so I started to interview other people who knew them and who were alive. And I started to read like a mad woman. And so between history books, first-person memoirs, second-person memoirs, interviewing people who were alive, and I found some remarkable people. For example, through complete serendipity, or we might say a miracle, I was able to locate a gentleman named Feivel Goldfarb, who was a student of Shlomo Zalman Vishnu in that cheder. He was his student at the age of 8, and he was alive living in Florida. So I had a long talk with him. He was able to describe, his teacher. He was able to describe what their house looked like. He was able to describe the town. It just was phenomenal. So I had things like that just helped me fill in. And then, of course, the trip back to Poland filled in so much. And the Stish family members that we sat with for hours and hours filled in so much from their perspective that it was great. So yeah, it was a lot of work. It was 3 years from start to finish, but it was a fantastic experience for me.
And Karen, another question comes from Hinda, and she said she wants to know, the family that hid your husband's parents, did they explain what motivated them to take the chance of hiding their Jewish neighbors?
We asked that question, of course, when we visited with them. And I've read a lot about interviews with righteous, we call righteous among the nations, right? The people who helped Jews during that horrible time. And like them, it was just, we're not heroes. We just did the right thing. And that was it. Some people's moral compass just stayed pointed north. And unfortunately, it was not the majority. It was a very small minority, but the Stishes were of those peoples whose moral compass stayed straight. And they just were like, of course we will help you. And we know our whole family is at danger, and we're going to do it anyway.
It's remarkable.
Yeah, it is remarkable.
Karen, will you tell us, as a last question here, a number of people would like to know, where can they find your book? Is it available in large print? And are you working on anything else now? My book is on Kindle. So if you want large print, you can use Kindle, and that will make the print as large as you want. It's on, Amazon is the place to go to buy the book. Although you can get it at the Holocaust Center if they're open for purchasing. But the book you can buy it either in softback, on Kindle. It's also in Audible, and the Audible version, which is an audio book, is phenomenal. If you like to listen to books like I do, you will love the rendition. I hired a fantastic woman to do the reading, and she did a really great job. I'm just love the audiobook. So if you like audiobooks, you can get it on Audible. You can get the book on Amazon. I don't think it's sold in large print in the book form, but in Kindle for sure you can get as large as you want. And it's the first half of the book is Sam and Esther's story, and the second half of the book is my story. That's how I divided up the way to tell the story. And I hope that you find it meaningful. And what I'm working on now is a very different book. I'm writing about my own family.
My family is not a Holocaust story. My family is a Seattle story. And I'm a 6th generation Seattleite. My first ancestor came here, Paul Singerman, in 1874. And yeah, it's a wonderful story of researching the 5 parts of my family tree that all came to Seattle between 1874 and 1911. So it's very exciting. It's very different, but it's, you know, the research is right outside my door. So that's kind of fun.
Definitely a different story. We had such a great comment here from Elka that I just want to read to you. And she says, "Thank you so much, Karen. I'm so honored to hear these stories. This is so incredible, and you do a wonderful job of telling us about them. I love that you bring it around to a life-changing message of gratitude. It's something I've been thinking a lot about recently too." So thank you so much, Karen, for sharing this story with us, and just your excellent presentation, and for helping us to remember how to be grateful and the importance of it.
Well, thank you, Ilana, and thank you to you and Richard for all the work you do at the Holocaust Center and everyone there, and putting on these really wonderful and important lunch and learn programs that people can just zoom into. So it's really important. The Holocaust Center does such important work, and that's why I'm so honored to be not only speaking today, but to be part of the Speakers Bureau. I find that for me, it's a very meaningful and very important part of my life's mission and goals for whatever time God still grants me on this planet.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Karen. And thank you to so many of you for joining today's program. We had over 200 people listening in today. This program was recorded, and you will find it on our website starting tomorrow. Programs like these are possible because of the generous support of our donors. If you found today's program interesting, please consider making a donation to help support more programs like this one. And you can make your donation quickly and easily on our website, and you'll find a link coming shortly in the chat. Please join us for our next program in 2 weeks on Tuesday, January 18th, entitled "The Dressmakers of Auschwitz, the True Story of the Women Who Sewed to Survive." As usual, it's from 12 to 1, and it's with Lucy Adlington, who chronicles the stories of the women who used their sewing skills to survive Auschwitz and the Holocaust. I want to give a special thank you to Richard Green, our Museum and Technology Director, who's running the technical side of this show. Also, thank you to our CEO, Dee Simon, and to our entire team, Lori Werschel-Cohen, Jenna Sittman, Paul Regelbrug, Julia Thompson, Morgan Romero, Amanda Davis, Devonshire Lockey, Katie Lawrence, and Allie Lapps. Thank you again to all of you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks on Tuesday, January 18th. This concludes our program for today.